So this is my original ice shatter video, and we're going to be looking at how to create an ice material and how to have cracks appear in it. We're then obviously going to be covering how to then shatter the ice, and we'll also be looking at how to write a few tiny scripts to automate some of the repetitive tasks. So the first thing I want to do is just explain that although I mentioned we're going to be doing a bit of scripting, I don't want people to be put off by that if you haven't done any scripting before, because we really are just doing a few lines of code, and even if you don't fully understand it, and although I'm going to be explaining it fully, this isn't an introduction to programming, perhaps it will pique your interest and will make you want to go and learn a bit more how to program, because once you do, it's very useful, and I hope this will show you that very tiny scripts can really help when you're doing lots of repetitive work. Anyway, I've got my normal text object here, and the first thing we're going to be doing is duplicating it, because it's still in its text form, and I want to keep a backup of it. So I'm going to press Shift-D, and then M and 0 to move it to layer 10, and then we're going to apply a remesh modifier. And the main reason we're going to be doing this is that it simply seems to help when we get onto the shading later on. I don't really know why, it just makes it look slightly better, slightly rougher around the edges. Although before that, we are going to press Alt-C, convert it to a mesh, so we can apply the remesh modifier. We want to untick remove disconnected pieces, and we're just going to turn this up to 5, just so it's smooth enough. You could go higher if you wanted, and then we're going to apply it. So if we tab into edit mode, I'm going to do the normal thing I do after I've remeshed a piece of text, and that's go in and fix a few of these edges. So you can see that we're getting a bit of flickering on a few of these, and the normal way I fix it is just by pressing K for the knife tool. I'm just going to turn it into triangles, and it seems to fix it. So I'm just going to do that in a few places around the mesh. I'm just going to tab into object mode just to see if there's any flickering edges. Looks like there's one up there. So again, K, and then enter to confirm. So now we have a cleaned, remeshed mesh. And the next thing we can do is do the fracturing part. And to do that, we're going to use the cell fracture add-on. And the first thing we need to do is enable it in the user preferences. So under add-ons, I'm going to type in cell. Just going to enable it. And then if I open the toolbar with T, we can see we've now got cell fracture. And selecting our object, we're going to press cell fracture. We don't want to use particles to shatter the text object. We want to use its own verts. And it looks like both of the options are now selected, but it's a bit of a glitch. If you hover over it, it disappears, so we know it's only going to use verts. I then also want to enable recursion, and recursion says that once it's fractured the object into pieces, it'll go back and fracture some of the pieces even more. And I want it to do that once, and I also want to do it randomly. Now, I don't want to enable sharp edges, and I don't want to apply any modifiers, and I also don't want any gaps in between the meshes, so that'll be 0, and we can leave those two options enabled. I also want the object centers to go to the centers of the new shards, and I don't want them to go onto the next layer, I want them to go onto layer 3. So making sure your text is selected once you've done that, you can't select it afterwards. Press OK, and we can see it shattering there. And if we select our text, we've still got our original here, and if we look on layer 3, we now have what looks like a normal mesh, but they're now all separate pieces. So I'm going to hide the toolbar, and the next thing we can do is actually get some physics going on them. So on layer 4, I'm just going to go into top view and Shift S cursor to center, so the cursor goes back to the center of the grid, and I'm going to add a plane, and this object is going to be what all the shards are going to collide with. So I'm just scaling it up quite big, because we're going to set it to be ice, and so when ice is slippery it spreads out quite a lot, so we need quite a big plane. And then I'm going to enable layer 3 again to bring back our shards. I'm going to start adding the rigid body settings. So there's several ways we can do this. I'm just going to go over to the physics panel and enable rigid body. We don't want it to be active. If you've used the game engine before, you'll be familiar with some of these settings. Active means the object is going to fall and react to gravity. We want this to be a solid floor, so we're going to say it's passive. And now we can look at the settings for the actual objects that are going to fall. So again, I'm just selecting one, rigid body, and this is going to be active because we do want it to fall and collide with everything. But now we have the problem of how do we apply the same settings to all our shards at once, because we don't want to go through all 250 odd objects doing it manually. But luckily there's a little toolbox we can use. It says rigid body tools here, so I'm going to expand that, and we have something called copy from active. It says copy the rigid body settings from the active object to the selected objects. So I'm going to select all our objects, deselect our plane, and then copy from active. Everything has gone green, and we can see they now all have the right settings. And to see these physics in action, all we have to do is press Alt-A, and there we go. And it's pretty good, and it's quite a bit quicker than trying to set it up to work in the game engine, because you'd have to flip back and forth between Blender and the game engine, and then you'd have to record keyframes. With this, it's very simple. You can now scroll through and see it shattering. But it's not really acting like ice yet, and so we've got a few settings that we're going to change. I'm going to select everything again, and again, deselecting the plane, I'm going to use the box tool with B, middle mouse drag a box around the plane, and it deselects it. And in our toolbar again, in our rigid body tools, I want to calculate mass, and it brings up this big box of all these different options. If you look at them, these are all different materials. So we've got concrete and charcoal, and down here we've got the ones that we want. We've got ice crushed and ice solid. And I'm going to choose ice solid. And if we now look at them, they've each got a mass based on their size. So smaller shards will have smaller mass, and bigger shards will have bigger mass. And before we did that, they all had a mass of 1, which didn't really make sense because they're all different sizes. So again, let's have another run through of that. It's looking a bit better, we're getting a bit more movement, but we're still not getting the sliding we want. And that is to do with the friction option on each of these meshes. So I'm going to put that down to 0.2, so there's very little friction, and so the shards should slide everywhere. So again, selecting everything, box select with middle mouse drag to deselect. I want to copy from active again, so now everything has a very low friction, but unfortunately we've lost our mass, so we need to reapply that again. So calculate mass, it's solid, and it's now recalculated that all again. And if we go back and Alt-A, you can see everything slides out far further than before, and some stuff is falling off the edge, so we'll just expand that even further and run it again, and that's why we needed a big plane. And so that's looking pretty good. But in my animation, I actually had the ice cracking before all this shattering happened, and I happen to know that it's around frame 111 that the shattering should start, and we can control when the shattering starts by going into the scene panel, and we can now see a rigid body world and a rigid body cache. And in the cache, I'm going to say the start frame should be 111, and then I'm going to bake it. And if we scroll through, we see we get to frame 111, and something goes a bit wrong. That's because, well, I don't know what it is, but all I've found is that it's not properly overwriting the old cache, so it's still reading kind of the old settings. And even if we do free bake and, try and bake it again, it doesn't actually work. It's still seeing all the old simulation. And the only way I've found to fix that is by saving, and then we're going to reopen this file. So now our cache has disappeared. We're going to free the bake, rebake it, and now we can see it's working properly. So now we've got all this time when the mesh could be cracking, and then it shatters. So the next thing we're going to do, we've created all these shards, we're actually going to go back and create the cracks that are appearing, because that's not actually done with the shards, because that'd be a bit too difficult. We're actually going to create separate objects. So I'm going to go to layer 1, and I'm going to change this to be a wire view, so we can see through it. And what I'm going to do is add a plane. So Shift A, add mesh plane. I'm going to rotate it on the Z by 90, go into edit mode, press delete vertices. So now we're left with just one big edge down here, which I'm going to scale down. And now we're going to start creating our cracks using this initial edge. And I'm doing this in a very specific way, because if we create these cracks in a different way, it's going to affect something we're going to do a bit later on. And you will understand that a bit better when we get to that point. But for the minute, all you need to know is that we need to start from an edge, and whichever way you want your cracks to start appearing, that's the way we need to extrude. So to explain that, I want the crack to appear like this, just for this crack, so I'm going to press E, and I'm going to keep doing that to create a randomized crack. And then I also want this part to be a crack, and I'm going to extrude it like that. If I'd extruded it from the other way around, that's the way the crack would appear, and that's to do with the build modifier that we're going to use later uses faces in the order that they were created. So it's very important that we do it in this particular manner. So now what I'm going to do is go around, I'm going to duplicate that edge, move it to somewhere else, and I'm going to create cracks all over our two letters. So obviously you should spend quite a lot of time doing that. I've just done it very rushed and very quickly. But if we look to the side, we can see we've got our cracks already. And what I'm now going to do is go into my camera view, because I have a camera set up on a different layer. And this is the view of the camera. And I want to select everything in edit mode and just make sure it's more at the front of the mesh. So I'm going to press G and then Y. And I'm just going to move them forward, and I can tell by here where it is. So they're still in the mesh but at the front. And that's because wherever we've got a corner, like this line and a few of these other lines, it kind of obscures what's behind it. So when we've got our cracks back here, a lot of the cracks are being crossed by lines in the text. And later on, that would mean that they were kind of just somewhat obscured by the materials we're going to use. What I now want to do is give a bit of randomness to these cracks, because they're all the same size, and the whole point of cracks is that they're random. So I'm going to enable proportional editing, and I'm just going to start scaling. And if you don't know what proportional editing does, it scales everything around it as well. So I'm going to press S and Y, and we've got a very big circle, and I'm just going to scale it down with a mouse wheel. And you can see I can scale this edge really small, and as you get further away, everything gets scaled less. So it allows us to create this pinching effect. So I'm just going to repeat that. I'm changing the size of the circle with the scroll wheel so everything's a bit more random. So again, you should be spending quite a lot of time fine-tuning this. I'm doing it very quickly, and the more you fine-tune this, the better your effect is going to be. And so I'm going to go into object mode, and we can now move these over to layer 2, and we can do some things to make them even more random. So the first thing is to add a subsurf modifier, and instead of the normal Catmull Clark, which will smooth everything, we're just going to turn it onto simple, which means it will subdivide it but not smooth it out at all. And I'll put that up to 2. We'll now add a displace modifier, and obviously that's a bit too much, so I'll just press new texture and reduce the strength to 0.2, and normally we'd then go and fine tune the texture, but actually it's going to work fine just like this. So you can see it started to really twist everything, and I'm just going to press space and then type shade smooth, so they're all smooth shaded. And the last modifier we'll add is a solidify modifier, because cracks are essentially gaps in ice, so there should be 2 kind of edges in my view. And I'm also going to turn off fill rim. I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference, but that is what I did in my final one. And just so we can see the effects, if I turn them all off, this is what we had originally. If I put the displace on, you can see it does a bit, but we really need the extra subdivisions of the subsurf to make this work a lot better. And then here's the extra thickness. The final thing we're going to do is add the build modifier, and I'm going to put that all the way up to the top. And if you haven't used it before, it basically builds the object. It's kind of in the name. Now it's set to do that over 100 frames. I want it to do it in 110. So it's going to start at frame 1. So let's go to frame 1 and see what happens. So you can see our cracks are starting to appear. And so by frame 111, they have all appeared. And you can see, if we focus on this crack here, you can see how it's growing. And it is growing in the order that I built it. So it's building along. And then I went back and added another section, so it's doing that bit. And then it's moving on to the other objects. The only slight problem at the minute is that they're all kind of going one after another. And really what should happen is that, they're all kind of happening at the same time. So to fix that, I'll just minimize that. Go into edit mode for all of them, select them all, and then press P. And we want to separate by loose parts. So now they've all got separate meshes, and I'll just select everything and press Ctrl-Alt-Shift-C and choose origin to the geometry. So they now have their individual origins at their centers. It's not really necessary, but now if we go back, we can see they're all kind of appearing at once, which is what we want. And you will get a little kind of error sometimes because it's basically saying, I haven't built anything, so these modifiers aren't going to do anything yet. As we move on, we get our cracking effect. Now our rigid bodies start falling apart on frame 111. And what's going to happen, and this is a common thing to do, is we are going to switch from our solid mesh, and I'm just going to change that back to a solid view. We're going to have this mesh appearing for most of it. We're going to get to frame 111, and then we're going to switch over to the rigid bodies, and then it's going to crack. And that's because we're going to be having a glass material, and so you would see all the cracks in the glass before it meant to have cracked. So we're going to be using the non-cracked version first. That also means that our cracks will also have to disappear when this text disappears. So we're going to have to animate the visibility and the render visibility of all these objects at once. And if we were to do that by hand, I've done that before. We go up into the outliner and we animate these two values by pressing I over them, and we can do that by hand. But there is a way to do it a bit quicker, and that's by writing a small script. So I'm going to bring out a new panel, and I'm going to change it to text editor and do new. And this is where we're going to do a little bit of scripting. I'm just going to enable line numbers and code highlighting. And if you haven't done any coding in Blender before, the first thing we do is say import BPY. So that imports all the Blender commands. And what we want to do is to be able to animate all these objects at once, dependent on which objects are selected. I want to be able to select all my cracks, run the script, and it inserts a keyframe where I want it. And when we select objects in Blender, Blender actually contains the names of all these selected objects in a list. And we can access that list with the command bpy, which stands for the Blender Python commands, .context.selected objects. And so this is a list containing all our selected objects at the minute. But we want to do something with this list. We want to be able to loop through every item in the list. So we want to say, well, for the first item in the list, do this, for the second item in the list, and so on for every single item. And to do that, we write for, and then this word can be any word. I'm just going to choose object because it makes sense, and then in. So what we're saying is, for every object in this list, and then we're going to say colon, do something. So it'll get to the first object in the list and do something, and then it'll get to the second one and repeat itself. And so every bit of code that's in here, that's in this for loop, which is what we call it, is going to be repeated. But it has to be indented like this is, so it's had 4 spaces in. And I'm going to replace this with something a bit more useful. And I'm going to say object.hide equals false, and then a semicolon. And what this does is the same thing as the outliner is doing. If we hover over this eye icon, you can see in the tooltip it says bpy.data.objects, and then it's got the name of the objects, and then .hide. Well, we don't actually need to know the name of the object because it's stored in this variable, and a variable is a container for a piece of information. So Blender is looking through this list, putting the name of the object into this container, and then we're accessing properties on this object. Now, if you haven't done any programming before, this is probably going to seem a bit complex, and you're probably not going to understand what it all means. That doesn't matter too much. It's just mainly explaining how useful scripts can be. So we've got our first command, which is saying we want to hide the object, and we're setting that to false because we don't want it to be hidden. And I'm going to do the same, object.hide render equals false. And so the hide render is this property here. And then I'm going to insert a keyframe with object.keyframe insert. And then we've got brackets opening and closing. And it's going to say data underscore path equals open quotes and close quotes. And then our data path is just going to be the property we want to animate. And it's just going to be hide. It's just going to be this property up here. And then we're going to do the same for the hide underscore render property. So object.keyframe underscore insert data underscore path equals hide underscore render. So I've got all my objects selected. I'm going to go to the frame where I want to set my first keyframe. So I want them to be visible on frame 110, but invisible on frame 111. So I'm going to click Run Script, and we can now see that all these values have gone yellow because we've got keyframes. And we can now see that here as well. So now we can go on to the next frame where we want them to be invisible. And I'm going to change these properties to be object.hide, yes, true, we want it to be hidden. And then we can run the script again. And remember, we've got the object selected because it's only going to work on our selected objects. So now our objects are all hidden and they've been keyframed. So if we go to the beginning, we can see them growing and they're cracking and then they will disappear. Now, like I said, we could have just keyframed this manually. It's not going to take too much time. And if you haven't done coding before, it's probably going to take longer to do this script than it would have been to just keyframe them on your own. But we've now got to do the same for another 250 objects. Because we've got all our rigid bodies, they also need to appear. As our cracks disappear, our rigid bodies need to appear. So I'm going to go to layer 3, where we've got all our shards, select them, and on frame 111 they should be visible, and on frame 110 they shouldn't be visible. So do we want them hidden? Yes, that's true. So I'll run the script on frame 110. They've now all been keyframed, so obviously we can't see them. And without deselecting them, I'm going to move to frame 111, where they should be visible. So do we want them hidden? No, we'll set that to false. And then we'll run the script. So now they've all appeared, and they've all been keyframed. And so if you watch up here, as we scroll through, these switch from being visible to invisible, and these switch from being invisible to visible. Obviously we can't see our cracks in the 3D view because we haven't got the layer enabled. So as I scroll through, cracks appear, and then rigid bodies replace that, which is exactly what we want. And that's why we did the script. Because yes, we could have done it for all the cracks, but to animate the visibility for 250 objects, that's a bit time consuming. And this is really where scripts come into their own because they're brilliant at doing repetitive tasks. So I'm going to close that for the minute. That's our keyframes done. And if you do it wrong, you can go over to the dope sheet and just delete the keyframes and rerun those scripts to create new keyframes. So I'm going to enable layer 1. And the one thing we didn't animate was visibility of our main text. So again, frame 110 should be visible, and I'll do it the old way this time. I'll press I over this value and I over this value. Next frame should be invisible, and I'll put keyframes in again with I. So if I just go into Y mode so we can see the cracks as well, we've got our solid text, which are cracks appearing. It's fully cracked, and then it shatters. So now that we've got most of the animation done, we can actually start doing some of the materials. And the first one we're going to do is for the object on layer 1, and that's our main text object. And what we're going to be doing is painting some of the edges, and to do that we're going to use texture paint mode. So I'm going to change to texture painting. And you can see we're not getting anything when we paint. So I'm going to bring out a UV image editor and do new image, and I'm going to call it edges.png, and I'm going to make it white by default. I'll click OK, and then I'm going to save it as a texture. So I'm going to click Save, and if we paint on, we're still not getting anything. And so then I'm going to go over to the node editor, because you do need an image texture node connected for this to work, because we're using cycles. So I'll do new material, Shift A, texture, image texture, and we'll just open that image we just saved and connect it, and we'll input texture coordinates and set that to UV. But we don't actually have any UVs yet, so we'll tab into edit mode, press U, Smart UV project, and we're going to use an island margin 0.03, which basically just means it'll add a little gap around all the UV islands. And if we go in the UV image editor, we can see it's left lots of little gaps around it, and that tends to help when we're doing texture painting. So we can collapse this down back into texture paint mode, and so we can see we're now painting on the mesh. So just to explain the texture we're going to be creating, we're going to be painting the edges of the mesh, so all the visible edges. We're not going to worry too much about the back edges, and this is just so we can give a slight highlight in the material. Now it's a very subtle effect, so it's up to you whether you think the effect that we're going to create is worth it, but I found it was worth it, and it just highlighted some of the edges that sometimes got lost when we apply the material. So I'm just going to go around painting with black, and it doesn't matter if we're too neat, it doesn't matter that it smudges too much. We just can be very rough about this. So now that's finished, you can see I did it very roughly, and you should really spend a bit more time just to get it a bit neater. But as I said, it doesn't really matter too much. And then I'm just going to go down to this panel, the Project Paint panel, and I want to save all edited so that it saves our texture. And we can now go back to Solid View and W mode. And the one thing I'm going to do at the minute is just add a subdivision surface modifier and shade it to smooth. And you can see it gives this kind of rough edge, and that's what I was talking about earlier when I said that the remesh modifier made a difference to how the shading looked, so that when we give it a subsurf modifier, it has this roughened but kind of soft edge, and that looks really good on the ice. So the next thing I'm going to do is drag out a panel, and we're going to use that as the node editor, and the first thing we're going to do is work on the world. So I'm going to click New World, and I'm going to do Shift A, and then Texture, Environment Texture, and I'm going to open an HDR image, and I'm going to use this one called St. Peter's. So I'm going to change it to mirrorable because that's the type it is, and then connect it to the background. So if I just enable the rendered view, we can see what we're getting. Obviously we've still got the texture we just painted on the text, but you can see it's very speckly, and that's not exactly what we want. But a really quick way to get rid of that is to Shift A and add a color RGB curves and slot it in there, and almost all the noise just clears up. And I presume that's because an HDR image obviously has lots more information than a standard PNG or JPEG, and I think just running it through this RGB curves node without actually doing any changes is basically compressing it back down to the normal color range, and I presume that's why it's removing the noise, because it's not got so much information to deal with. The next thing I'm going to do is just, we want to change the color a bit, it's a bit too warm, so Shift A, color, hue and saturation, we don't want any hue, and I'm going to reduce the saturation to 0.4, and you can already see it's making a big difference. And then finally I'm going to crank up the value of the background so it's a bit brighter, and we're getting a nice bright but cold world. So now I can move on to the actual material for the text. You can see we've got our image here. We don't quite want it doing that. So I'm going to delete the diffuse material and Shift A and do a glossy shader, and then Shift A, shader and glass. And we're going to mix these with a Shift A mix shader. And so we're going to connect this all up. And you can see we're already getting a pretty good look, but I don't want any glossiness. And I'm going to change the IOR value, that's the index of refraction, and that's how light bounces around once it gets inside a glass material. I'm going to reduce that to the actual IOR of ice, and I believe that is 1.31. And then we're going to use the texture we just painted as the value for the mix. So then I'm going to add in a converter and a color ramp, just so we can fine tune this texture, because it's not quite doing what we want yet. And I'm going to change the image to be non-color data, so it's using black and white. And I'm going to flip around the colors, so we're just mixing the other way around. So we're mostly getting the glass effect instead of all the glossy effect. And then I'm just going to reduce the color of the glass a bit, so it's slightly darker. And now you can see that we're mixing between a slightly darker glass material and a very light glossy material, and that's giving a slight highlight on the edges. And if we adjust the color ramp to make the colors a bit harsher, we can see that as we bring in the white slider, we're getting a really strong outline, and as we bring it back down, it's getting a lot fainter. So you can fine tune this. And to show you what we're actually doing with this, I'm going to add in a temporary diffuse shader and plug in our texture. And so you can see it's a bit darker at the minute, but as I bring this in, it's getting stronger, and so we're increasing the effect. And as I bring this down, the effect's getting fainter until it's nearly nothing. So if I just change it back to the main one, delete this, obviously we can see it's barely there. So we can bring it up until we find something that we like. So again, this is quite a subtle effect. If I were to disconnect it and change this just to fully glass, this is what it looks like. And you may prefer this, which is fine. But I prefer just giving slight highlights to the outlines, so you can see particularly here and on the edges. So the next thing I'm going to do is add in a bump map. So this is going to be another texture. So it's going to be an image texture. And this is one I downloaded from CG Textures, and it's called plastic0027_2_s.jpg. And it's actually under the plastic category, and it's actually a plastic bag, but it does actually give the appearance of ice, or at least it does to me. So again, this is going to be UV coordinates. I'm going to add in a converter, a math node, and set it to multiply. I always do this just so we can multiply it by less than 1 and it will get fainter. So if we just plug this in to the displacement, you can see it's very strong. But if we reduce that to 0.1, we're getting basically 10% of the effect, and I'm actually going to reduce it to 0.04. So we can see we're getting a bit of an effect, but it's not really too clear. And I'm actually going to scale the texture up a bit by adding Shift A and then a vector mapping node. So if I just put the strength up a bit more so we can see what's going on, I'm actually going to increase the size, and it may seem a bit weird that we're actually putting in smaller numbers, 0.75, 0.75 and 0.75. So now I've got a slightly bigger texture. And what I also want to do, because at the minute you might be able to faintly see the streaks are kind of going along, and I kind of preferred it when it was diagonal. So I'm just going to change that to 45, and we've now got diagonal bump map. And I'm actually going to reduce that back down to 0.04. And what I'm also going to do at this stage is bring in a background that I already have made, and it's also got my camera on it. So we've just got this curved background, which is just an extruded plane upwards with this subsurf on it, and it's just going to give a nice gradient background. And if we render the view, we can see we're getting a bit of a better effect now we've got a background in. And the next thing we're going to do is bring back our cracks and give them a material as well. So I'm just going to click new material, and I'm going to call this cracks and then slash bubbles, because we're also going to be using this for the bubbles that we're going to create in a minute. But all this is going to be is a glass shader, and again we're going to change the IOR to 1.31 and make sure that's nice and bright. Then we'll select everything and press Ctrl L to link the materials. So now they're all sharing the glass material. Now if we bring back layer 1 and layer 5, which is my background, and we zoom in, we can see that we've got our cracks appearing. And we can't see all of them at the minute because we're not in the right place in the timeline because they haven't actually been built yet. So if we go along, we can see we've got far stronger cracks now that are appearing all over the model. But like I said, we're going to create some bubbles. So I'm just going to Shift A, and I'm going to add an icosphere, and then I'm just going to shade smooth, and then I'm going to scale it down, apply the scale with Ctrl A, and then I'm going to assign the cracks slash bubbles material before moving it out of the way onto layer 9. So to create the bubbles, I am going to select our text, I'll collapse this down for the minute, and we'll just show layer 1, and we'll go into wireframe mode, and I'll disable the subsurf so we can actually see what we're doing, and we're going to add a new particle system. I'm going to leave it at 1000, but we want them all to emit at the same time and to be able to last 250 frames, and we're going to emit from the volume so they're all inside, and we don't want them evenly distributed, we want it to be more random. We're going to reduce the normal because we don't actually want them going anywhere, we're just using them to make something appear rather than having to move, and because of that we don't need any physics, and you can see it's actually updated now so we can see what we're doing. And under render, I'm going to change the object to our icosphere. And then I'm just going to crank up the random all the way, and we're starting to get the effect of bubbles. But they're probably a bit big at the minute, so I'm going to try 0.025. And one last thing I'm going to do is turn off all the field weights, just so they're not going to be affected by gravity at all. So if we go into rendered view, and I just re-enable our subsurf modifier. So if I zoom in, we can see our bubbles, and maybe I will put them up to maybe 0.035. So now we can work on the material for the actual rigid bodies, the shards we've created. I'm just going to select one. So I'm just going to use the material we had before, which is this material.002, and we're going to make sure we click the 2 to make a copy of the material. And that's the main shader that we've been using for the ice. But this time, we're not going to need a lot of these extra nodes, so I'm going to remove the mix shader and the glossy, because we only want glass, and then I'm going to remove the color ramp and the image texture, and we don't need the mapping node. Change the coordinates to be generated because they don't have any UVs, and then we're going to have a look at it in a minute, but I'm going to reduce the bump to 0.05, which is pretty low, but they don't need much more. And then I'm going to select everything like we did last time and Ctrl L and link all the materials, so they're now sharing all the materials. So if we bring back the background, and what you'll notice is that it looks quite boring, really. These don't look very good as shards when they're rendered, and that's because, like with the main mesh, they actually look a lot better when they have a remesh applied to them. So I'm going to put on smooth shading, and uncheck remove disconnected pieces, and then I'm going to select everything and Ctrl L, and this time we're going to do modifiers. Now at this point you do have to be a bit careful because the remesh modifier can be quite heavy in the fact that it creates quite a lot of vertices, and so copying it to 250 other objects at the same time, you've got to be a bit careful, otherwise Blender might crash. But we'll give it a go. Control L, modifiers, but it's now smoothed everything out. And if we bring back the background, Shift 5, and you can see it's looking quite dark, and that's actually because of the bump map. So maybe I will actually reduce that, and that's because it should actually be 0.005, so quite a bit low, and everything brightens up quite a bit. So if I just collapse that down, and then move on to a later frame, we can see we've got our nice bright ice. But what we want to do now, I mean, we created the particle system for the main piece of text, and we now want to create a particle system that we can use on all these individual rigid bodies. So I'm going to select one, new particle system, and we're going to use the settings from the previous one. So now it says they're linked, so we will click that to make it individual, and I'll reduce the number to 5, because obviously we don't want 1,000 particles per rigid body. That would be a bit too much. And if I just go into wireframe mode, you can see we've only got one particle right here in the middle, and that's because the remesh modifier needs to be below the particle system. So now we've got a few particles dotted around, and that's working fine. And what we're going to do is making sure only our rigid bodies are visible. We're going to select everything, and like we did before, Control L, and we're going to link the modifiers. So now they all have the particle system modifier, and that's actually a way of applying a particle system to a lot of objects at the same time, because it's the modifier that needs to be on all of them. So now if we give that a render, we might be able to see some of the bubbles, and we can see them here, and you know, it's a pretty subtle effect again, but I still think it's worth it. So now if we zoom out and just scrub through the timeline, well, what I'm actually finding is that even though we've got the rigid body cache, which we calculated earlier, everything's being really slow, and that's because we've got the particle system and then the remesh modifier. I think what the remesh modifier is doing is seeing that there are lots of bubbles inside each of the shards, and it's also trying to remesh them, and it's making everything very slow. And so until we're actually finished, it might be a good idea to disable all the modifiers. And a really quick way of doing that without actually having to delete them is by doing another script. So I'm going to again make sure only our rigid bodies are showing, change to the text editor, and we're going to do a new one. And again, I'm going to enable line numbers and code highlighting. And like before, we're going to import the Blender commands. And then similar to what we did before, we'll do for object in bpy.context.selected objects, and then a colon. So we're saying for every item in the list of selected objects, and like last time, we want to access a property on the object, and we actually want to access the modifiers. So if we go over to this value here, the I, we can see it's bpy.data.objects.modifiers.showViewport. Now, it's the show viewport value that we're interested in, but instead of it being right after objects like last time, so in the previous script, we had object and then .hide, object.hide render. In this one, we can't just access object.modifiers because there is a list of modifiers. So we're actually going to do something similar to what we've already got for the list of selected objects. We're going to loop through all the modifiers. So we're then going to do for modifier in object.modifiers. So this is saying for every object in this list, find the list of modifiers, which is here, and get one of them. And so now we can say modifier.show_viewport equals false. And so if I select all our shards and then run this script, we can see it's gone through and it's unchecked the visibility. And so now we're back to full speed. We can scrub through very easily. And again, if we want to turn it back on, which we may do later, You just change it to true, and then run the script again, and it does take a bit of time because it's got to loop through them all, and it's re-enabled all our modifiers. But now we're back to the slow scrub speed. So again, it's not completely necessary to use this script, but I am trying to show that it does have a really good use. Anyway, the next thing we can do, we can close that down, is set up the render layers because we're pretty much done. We're almost ready to render. So on our first render layer, we want everything apart from layers 4 and 5. On layers 5, it's our curved background, and on layer 4, it's the plane that we were using to collide the meshes with, so we obviously don't want that rendered. And I'm also going to include a vector pass in this, just so we can do a vector blur. And then our second render layer, this is going to be called background. This is just going to be layer 5, so this has only got the background. And I'm also going to enable transparent, so that allows us to composite the layers back together because they'll have transparency in them. And for the samples, I'm going to set 100 render samples, which isn't that much considering that we're using, you know, glass and glossiness. So now I'm going to enable our layers, so layers 1, 2, 3, and 5. And I'm going to render this second part of the timeline. So I'm going to click, and obviously I have to wait because it's got all the modifiers applied to it. And then I'm going to crank that up to full, and we'll give that a render. So we can see that's rendered. So now we can do the compositing. So I'm going to open up the node editor, want compositing, and want to use nodes, and I'm going to enable a backdrop. And I'm just going to Control Shift and click on this node, and it creates a viewer for us. And we can see our image, and I'm going to press V just to zoom it out a bit. And then we're going to press Shift D to duplicate this render layer. And I'm going to change this to background. And the first thing we're going to do is add a color, alpha over, plug our background into the top, and we've added our layers back together. So then we can apply our vector blur, and we're not actually going to see too much effect because at this part of the timeline there's not going to be a huge amount of movement, but there is going to be a bit. So vector blur, and we'll add in our speed and our Z, and we'll turn on curved for a bit of a better effect, and we'll zoom in with Alt V, and like I said, we're probably not going to see too much of the effect, but you will at a different part of the timeline when it first shatters. The next thing I'm going to do is just blur this background a bit, because we only used 100 samples, and while that's fine for the glass shards, it does mean that the background is still a bit grainy. And even though I could have set an individual number of render samples just for the background, that's going to take longer to render, and there's no point doing that if we can optimize it in the compositor. So I'm going to Shift A, filter, and add a blur, set it to relative, and 0.5 and 0.5, and we can blur out most of that noise. So if we zoom in, and I'll just disable this node with M, see all the noise comes back, and enable it again, and it all disappears. So I'm just going to disable both these blur nodes for the minute because they do slow the rest of the compositing down. And the next thing I'm going to do is add something which is quite overused a lot of the time, but I'm going to try not to. And I'm just going to hold Shift, click, and drag to add a reroute node just to make it a bit easier to add nodes here. And the thing that's often overdone is the distort, lens distortion, and we're going to add a bit of chromatic aberration. So again, V to zoom out, and I'm going to set this dispersion value to 0.015, and what you can see is that it gives the kind of refraction effect that you get at the edge of photos sometimes, and you know, that's often overused, but I think we can get away with it, and it's particularly nice to see it when we've got something like glass or ice, because it gives us the idea that maybe the light is being refracted through the ice. And then onto something else which is also overused quite a lot. We'll just Shift A, color mix, set it to multiply, and then I'm going to Shift A and add a matte and an ellipse mask, and we're going to add a vignette in. See, that's a bit of a strong vignette, so I'm going to increase this to 1.3 and then 0.6 to make it slightly bigger. Duplicate this blur because we're going to blur out the vignette. So I'll enable this node with M, and I'm going to do a massive blur of 15. And obviously that's still a bit too strong, so I'm going to reduce the mix value to 0.5. And again, that's just adding in some camera effects. It's probably a bit overdone, so maybe I could turn it down to 0.35. And if we disable it, we can see the difference. So that's basically it. That's most of the effect done. But there are a few final adjustments we can do. So you may remember in my original video, I had some close-up shots. If I just duplicate my camera with Shift D, press Ctrl 0 to assign it, and then zoom in with GZZ. And then if we just Ctrl B to box select, and if I change it to render view, we can actually see that the material doesn't look too good. And that's because I cheated. Well, I didn't cheat. I just had a slightly different material for when we were zoomed in than for when I did the wide shots. And to do that, if I just bring up the node editor again, and we're just going to edit this material, I actually animated this vector mapping node. So instead of 0.75, I had it at 5, 5, and 5, because that made the texture far smaller. And I also changed the bump to be at 0.01. So you get a far nicer result when the texture is smaller. So I actually just animated these in the normal way by pressing I over them to insert keyframes for when I change shots, just because it looks slightly better. And one final thing that you can do to improve your shot, if I go back to where we've got the shattering, change to the wide camera, clear out the border with Ctrl or B, I'm actually going to set some depth of field on this camera. So I'm going to show the limits so I can see where the focus point of the camera is, and just change it so it's roughly in the middle of the pile, and then set a radius of 0.05. And if we have a look at the rendered view, we can see that in the foreground it's slightly blurry, in the background it's slightly blurry, and in the middle it's nice and in focus. So if we just give that one final render, here we see the final result, and you can see the compositing has come into effect. So I hope you have found this useful. Maybe you've learned something, maybe you feel a bit less intimidated about programming, and even if you don't, maybe you can at least see that there is some use to learning how to make small scripts to make some of the processes you use a bit quicker and a bit more efficient. So as always, I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.